Right. So I think we're just going to get started, to be honest, because I'm not sure if people are going to file in or not, and if not, it doesn't really matter, does it? I think we can just get it going. So briefly, this Stephen Ashe has kindly agreed to speak to us and run one of these sessions, which is on remembering Tosa Ali and Pakistani responses to racist violence in East London. Until recently, Dr. Stephen Ashe was a researcher in the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Unit at the University of Manchester. He was previously employed as a research associate in the Centre of Dynamics of Ethnicity, also at Manchester. And he's the co-editor of Researching the Far Right, Theory, Method and Practice, which is coming out later this year with Routledge, and the co-author of Race and Ethnicity in Britain, also coming out later this year, and reframing the Left Behind, Racism Ruins Lives, and Equality, Diversity and Racism in the Workplace. So we are in very good company with Stephen to discuss this. And he's also written an article on this, an academic article on this. I think this comes partially from that. Is that right, Stephen?
Yeah. It's kind of a summary of that article, yeah.
And yeah, so Stephen's going to chat for like 20-25 minutes, and then we're going to try and have as much of a discursive sort of Q&A as possible. Because there's only like 30 of us, when we do the questions, you can actually just put your mic on and camera on if you want. If you don't want to, just whack it in the chat box and I'll read it out. So yeah, I'm just going to hand over to you, Stephen.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for kind of logging in, and thanks for having me as part of this event. So when I worked at the Centre on Dynamics of Ethnicity at the University of Manchester, I was part of a research team with Satnam Birdley, the author of Racism, Class and the Racialised Outsider, and a historian called Lawrence Brown. And what our research tried to do was to unpick hidden histories, hidden anti-racist and anti-imperial histories and struggles for social justice in Britain. And we kind of focused primarily on the 1960s and the 1970s. And one of the, as you can just see from the table, we created a database where we put in the dates of different forms of kind of activity, different types of kind of political responses and anti-racist and anti-imperial struggle during the time period 1966 to 1990. And the reason that we came across the racist murder of Tosa Ali is because you can just see there's like a first peak in the table and there's a red line just hitting the number 6 around about 1969, 1971. And that, when we looked at our database that we had created, that was kind of an unexpected finding. None of the team were really sure what was going on, what was the reason for that particular spike. So when we started looking closer at it, in terms of going into the archives and digging out some files and looking at different sources, we came across different forms of resistance undertaken by Pakistani organisations in Tower Hamlets in 1970. And these different kind of forms of resistance were taking place just after the murder, around the time just before and just after the murder of Tosa Ali. For those of you who don't know, Tosa Ali was a 50-year-old kitchen porter and father of 4 who was brutally stabbed in the St Leonard area of Tower Hamlets in East London in April 1970. After being attacked, Mr. Ali managed to make his way home before dying in hospital. One of the striking things when you look at the archival and documentary sources that are available to us, mostly held in the Peter Shore collection at the London School of Economics, it's striking how quickly Tosa Ali and the impact of his murder on his family and the local community more broadly fades from view. In fact, one of the things that really struck me, and I suppose it's one of my main regrets from that period of archival research, was that we were unable to unearth a picture of Tosa Ali. We were able to put a human face to the name and kind of bring this person's life history into view. But one of the things we know from looking at the different forms of resistance in and around that period in Tower Hamlets in 1970 was that Tozer Ali's murder did have a profound effect on both the local community and national politics. In fact, this was a period in which events in Tower Hamlets captured, even if it was only for a short while, the attention of the national media. And it was in the newspapers every day for about a period of about 2 months. So what I'm just going to talk about is I'm just going to kind of summarise some of the kind of main things that came out of the article that Satnam, Lawrence and I published in Race and Class. And just as Amit said earlier, I can make a PDF copy of the article freely available to anyone who's interested. So in the article, what we did was, when we analysed the different sources, we identified what we felt were two quite distinct forms of response to rising levels of racist violence in and around that time. And I just want to begin by talking a little bit about the integration, what we've called the integrationist approach, which was an attempt to form a collaborative relationship between the political establishment, existing state structures, and different sections of civil society, thereby assimilating the recently settled Pakistani migrant community into the so-called British values of law and order, and to the authority of the police. Soon after Enoch Powell's infamous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, Joseph Hunt, the chairman of the Citizens Committee of Tower Hamlets, informed the police that the situation regarding racist violence in the area was, and I quote, becoming serious. In response to the rising levels of racist violence, the Citizens Committee established what was called an investigation clinic, whereby they worked alongside churches, synagogues, mosques, youth workers, community workers, teachers, personnel firms, in an effort to, and I quote again, work with the police in any matter relating to community problems, and to be a panel through which guidance could be given to any member of the community to assist them in getting justice for any act of violence against them. The investigation clinic also had a clear strategic function, namely, again I quote, to help the Asian community understand the role of the police by carefully examining incidents they have reported to the police and seeing that such reports are properly dealt with as far as the powers of the police allow. Indeed, the local Asian community was supposed to be educated with regards to the police's way of doing things in the colonial mother country. This was a message that was delivered and time and time again, underpinned by colonial racial thinking. And these are just some of the newspaper articles that we found. Again, the slides I'll share for anybody that wants to, and they can read the articles themselves. But these are just some of the quotes that we got when looking through the newspaper articles, and it's just some of the language, the pejorative nature of the language. Like they, for example, still have the village headman idea. This notion that the Pakistani population in Tower Hamlets were coming from villages whereby they didn't understand, well, supposedly didn't understand what policing was, and they needed to be educated to the kind of so-called British way of doing things. Immediately after Tozer's murder on the 6th of April 1970, the Pakistani High Commissioner visited the East End of London in order to, and I quote, let the Pakistani community know that he was very concerned about the increasing level of attacks on them. The Commissioner held meetings with the Community Relations Committee, as well as speaking at a local meeting attended by over 100 people, including the local MP, Peter Shore, the police, and Joseph Hunt, the chairman of the Citizens Committee. The Home Secretary, James Callaghan, also attempted to reassure the High Commissioner that special efforts were being made to seek out and arrest the perpetrators of racist violence. During the same meeting, Callaghan also insisted, and I quote, the effects of single incidents should not be exaggerated. So there's a kind of two things going on there, I think. I think there's this attempt to say that we're taking the issue seriously and we're looking to deal with it, but at the same time, trying to downplay the significance and the pervasiveness of racist violence at that particular time. Shortly after the High Commissioner's visit, Peter Shore wrote to Callaghan to inform him that there had been another 20 attacks in Tower Hamlets between February and April 1970. Following a progress report and meetings with representatives from the local Pakistani community, Shore released a press statement claiming that he was confident that the police could handle the problem, and that he had no doubt of their anxieties and determination to handle it effectively. Following that press release, the National Federation of Pakistani Associations called a meeting at the local Grand Palace Hall. Attended by Shore, the police and representatives from the Pakistani Welfare Association, the meeting drew up a 5-point programme condemning violence and appealing to the police and local authorities to take action. This was followed by another exploratory meeting at the House of Commons, organised by the National Community Relations Council, Peter Shore, and the MP for the neighbouring constituency of Poplar. Attended by representatives of the Pakistani Progressive Party and the Universal Coloured People's Association, the minutes from this meeting note, and I quote, "There was a feeling that the police had not been fully cooperative in answering calls for help." Throughout April 1970, regular meetings were arranged to create a dialogue between the local MPs, police, the Citizens' Council, the Inner London Educational Authority, local churches, and representatives from the National Federation of Pakistani Associations and the Pakistani Welfare Association. The first meeting was held shortly after a series of so-called skirmishes between young Pakistani men and skinheads in the Brick Lane area, which included over 50 white youths marching through the market, smashing the windows of Pakistani-owned shops and leaving 3 Pakistani youths requiring hospital treatment. 2 white youths and 2 Pakistani youths were arrested. However, it was only the 2 Pakistani youths that would be charged with carrying and the charge was carrying an offensive weapon. Some degree of consent to the so-called virtues of law and order and the authority of the police was achieved through a coming together of the local political establishment. However, some Pakistani political leaders were becoming increasingly frustrated with this, what we've called the integrationist approach, increasingly frustrated with just organising meetings which were, for some, described as talking shops. Indeed, the Pakistani Welfare Association, the National Federation of Pakistani Associations, and the Demonstration Committee of Multiracially Committed Pakistani Associations organised a national rally in London in May 1970 under the banner "Stop Skinhead Hooliganism, Demand Effective Measures, Support Multiracial Defence." This rally marked both a departure from what up until now had been an approach, as I said, that was based on meetings, lobbying politicians and letter-writing campaigns. This was, to quote the late Stuart Hall, part of a growing turn to the politics of the street. The second approach, as part of this departure from more traditional political methods to the politics of the street, the second approach we identified was what we've termed the autonomous approach, which was part of a wider network of collective anti-racist action that was increasingly bypassing the state, mainstream political parties, and the apparatuses of the race relations industry. I think it's important to note that both the integrationist and the autonomist approach, at least initially, lobbied the political establishment. They shared similar tactics and methods. They organised political meetings, demonstrations and marches, and collected information documenting the scale of racist violence inflicted upon the local Pakistani population. And we think of so many initiatives today, for example, the new monitoring project in East London, which continues to monitor and collect data on these issues. And I think that tells us that the issues have never been dealt with in, well, to my mind anyway, in a effective and satisfactory way. But as I say, there was differences between this integrationist approach and this autonomous approach. And in many ways, this dates back to 2 years prior to the murder of Tozer Ali. Organisations such as the Universal Coloured People's Association and the Racial Action Adjustment Society have become increasingly concerned with challenging fascist violence, police brutality, and documenting and fighting the cases of those who had either been framed or beaten up by the police. Between 68 and 70, a number of black radical anti-imperialist and socialist groups entered the political field in East London. Immediately after Tozer Ali's murder, the Pakistani Progressive Party and the Universal Coloured People's Association distributed leaflets advocating self-defence tactics, and they did so after the local MP Peter Shore had refused to help them after they'd reported 16 complaints to the MP. They also distributed a leaflet at this time, and the leaflet stated, "If the law cannot protect us, then we have the right to defend ourselves." The PPP, which claimed to have 275 members, announced that they would be setting up self-defence classes. Supported by the Universal Coloured People's Association, the PPP told the national media that they were a defensive organisation with no intention of fighting or killing anyone, but if it comes to us, we will hit back. The PPP and their allies, creating these self-defence groups, they felt that this was necessary because of the failures of the police and the broader political establishment. At the same time, the Pakistani Workers' Union also argued that it would leave attempts to seek reform of the police to the recognised welfare associations who had opted to work with the local political establishment, noting, and I quote, "They can write letters and sit in offices. Our aim is the protection of our people." What is more, the president of the Pakistani Student Federation also noted that self-defence patrols would be multiracial. The PPP and the Pakistani Workers' Union responses to racist violence in Tower Hamlets built upon a network of black radicals, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, socialists and some trade unionists. Immediately after Tozer Ali's murder, the chair of the Working People's Party of England wrote to Shore, inviting him to a local meeting being organised by the Pakistani Workers' Union with the support of the Black People's Alliance and the local region of the Transport and General Workers' Union, as well as members of the Scientific, Technical and Managerial Staff Union. The national press reported that up to 1,000 people attended this meeting, where they heard organisers pour scorn on the meeting that Shore had organised with other Pakistani organisations the previous day. The meeting also heard from a local Labour councillor in Tower Hamlets who resigned from the party, claiming that we had to get on the streets and stop the violence. At the end of the meeting, 30 to 40 men stepped forward and volunteered to take part in self-defence patrols. According to various national newspapers, up to 200 men took part in self-defence patrols throughout the month of April 1970. Supported by the Black Panther movement, the Black People's Alliance and the Irish Liberation Solidarity Front, up to 2,000 people marched to Downing Street on the 3rd of May 1970. Before the rally set off, speeches connected the local struggle against racist violence to broader international struggles, claiming that, and I quote, "Racialism was a function of capitalism," and demanding that Pakistanis see their fight as an aspect of the world struggle of oppressed classes. During the march, the Irish National Liberation Front, Solidarity Front, told reporters the Pakistani cause was the same as the Irish cause. As the march passed the Irish embassy, demonstrators chanted, "British imperialism out, people's war, yes. Black power, people's power. All unite, black and white, and disembowel power." Once the demonstration reached Downing Street, the Pakistani Workers' Union submitted a memorandum outlining that, quote, "every peaceful method to relieve their suffering had been pursued, and that they'd reached the point where they realised the only answer lies in self-defence for their safety and their welfare." By the spring of 1970, the Pakistani Workers' Union and the PPP had shifted away from trying to engage the government, coming to see institutional approaches as incapable of reform. Whereas the integrationist approach had sought reform, the autonomous approach sought to defend aspects of the state. The alliance of black power, anti-imperialists and socialists sought to tackle the dominant values and apparatuses of law and order, while also challenging established forms of local Pakistani leadership. In contrast to the integrationist approach, the Pakistani Progressive Party and the Pakistani Workers' Union articulated to my mind, a more sophisticated understanding of racism, demonstrating how Powellism, the 1968 Commonwealth Immigration Act, fascist political agitation, and everyday racist violence were connected by a shared desire to keep Britain white. However, both Liberals and Conservatives considered the call to form self-defence squads as being inflammatory. For example, Peter Shaw, the MP, said that these self-defence groups were making the situation worse. The National Federation of Pakistani Associations argued that the Pakistani Workers' Union were irresponsible and dangerous. The chair of the Citizens Committee said, "We don't need vigilantes coming in from outside Tower Hamlets. We don't need stirrers." At the same time, the former president of the Pakistani Welfare Association opposed the socialist politics of the Pakistani Progressive Party and the Pakistani Workers' Union, while the president of the League of Overseas Pakistani Organisations called for a multiracial approach. Sections of the right-wing press were also critical of the self-defence mobilisations, claiming, and I quote, "Blackness will only breed white resentment." The rebuttal of self-defence tactic was, in part at least, a feature of how law and order came to be understood and experienced through race. For some integrationists, both self-defence measures and the broader socialist politics that underpinned it were deemed incompatible with a Pakistani identification. At the same time, integrationists, along with parts of the right-wing press, denied the multiracial basis of the autonomous approach while making their own pleas to multiracial unity. By framing Black Power, the Pakistani Progressive Party and the Pakistani Workers' Union as extremist outsiders, these attempts to condemn self-defence tactics also sought to reassert the authority and leadership of the National Federation of Pakistani Associations and the Pakistani Welfare Association, the local MP, the police, and the Citizens Committee. Also, the view that self-defence tactics would only risk further violent disorder shifted the focus away from police ambivalence and the failure of the government to halt rising levels of racist violence and harassment. I suppose in some ways, vigilantism was seen to be a more immediate and pressing problem, claiming that it had breached the dominant values of law and order and the authority of the police. In this sense, the term vigilantism was used as a political act to turn a form of political mobilisation into a criminal act, thereby making it easier to uphold the liberal order, while at the same time imposing legal sanctions, such as arresting the victims of racist violence and harassment when acting in self-defence. What I want to kind of just do before I finish up is, I just want to connect the events around Tozer Ali's murder to a kind of longer history, but at the same time bring that into the present and some of the issues that I think that are pertinent today and are on an ongoing matter of kind of political debate and mobilisation. The notion of defence debates have emerged time and time again in relation to different groups in Britain in response to different forms of racist violence. So, for example, we can date it back to the emergence of the 43 group in East London in response to the street attacks of Oswald Mosley and the British Union fascists and the anti-Semitic violence that was around at that particular time. But we can also trace some of the debates about self-defence into the kind of past decade, whether that be opposing the British National Party, the English Defence League, Britain First, and more recently the Football Lads Alliance. But I think what's happened in terms of how the mainstream media and how mainstream politicians talk about different forms of political mobilisation, particularly the issue of self-defence and mobilising in the streets, can be traced back to the Public Order Act that was introduced in 1936. I've argued elsewhere that the Public Order Act created a politics of moral equivalence, whereby increasing police powers was seen as a response to deal with public disorder, when in fact it's infrequently and very much hesitantly used when it comes to dealing with racist violence and the far right in the streets of Britain. I think what's happened historically is the Public Order Act has bolstered in legislation a normative sense of Britishness based around law and order, thus obscuring racism in Britain's colonial history. What we've seen through the Public Order Act is the police have facilitated marches of the far right, marches of the far right, to so-called static demonstrations. I don't think there is such a thing as a static demonstration when the police are marching people through communities to get to those demonstration points. And keeping with this history, and keeping this history in our mind, for me, reveals a tension that has long existed between preserving that particular sense of British political liberty and national pride in relation to notions of democracy and free speech, the right to free assembly, and those of law and order. And I think we can bring this back into the present again. So just a few years ago, I was part of a research team commissioned by the Scottish Government to look into loyalist and Irish Republican marches and parades in Scotland to assess their community impact. And one of the things that we did during that research was we saw time and time again the expression of different forms of racism, which I've outlined in the blog on this slide. We've seen time and time again the police stand back and escort and facilitate, whether it be loyalist, whether it be far right, groups such as the Scottish Defence League, marching them through particular areas, marching them to demonstration points, at the same time ignoring racism. In that blog, there's a quotation from a very senior figure in the Scottish Police, who says that when it comes to all the symbolism and the language of songs and chants, he says he doesn't have a Scooby. And this is a police officer of 30 years experience, so it makes you wonder what he had been doing for 30 years. But this politics of moral equivalence has re-emerged more recently in Glasgow as well. As some of you might have seen, the various forms of kind of Black Lives Matter protests in Glasgow. But what's a kind of worrying development is the ways in which this has been reported in the media again. Some of you might be aware of a protest, a white supremacist protest in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, which was opposed by anti-racists and anti-fascists in America. In response to those demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, Donald Trump said, you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. There were clashes in George Square in Glasgow between anti-racist protesters protesting in support of Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd. But what was quite concerning was the ways in which the Scottish media reported on this. And just on the slide, I've just put a quote on how the Scottish media, the Herald, which is one of the main kind of broadsheet newspapers in Scotland, reported on the involvement of Celtic fans, a group known as the Green Brigade, which is a left-wing group who have a history of anti-racist mobilisation, and particularly in and around issues relating to immigration and asylum. But what's really worrying is that an academic and Scottish advisor is quoted in this article, and it's just how eerily similar his language is to that of Donald Trump when he says that the issue of Black Lives Matter was being used as a political football and that he sees tensions as good guys versus bad guys. So Donald Trump says there's very fine people on both sides, but one of the academics who advises the Scottish Government on these issues has again re-invoked that kind of politics and moral equivalence, saying there's good guys and bad guys on both sides. So I hope that gives you a bit more familiarity with the kind of hidden story of the kind of things that were going on in and around the time of Tozer Ali's murder. But also I hope what I've kind of tried to show is the ways in which these issues predate Tozer Ali's murder, but also continue to inform both police strategy and tactics in the present, but also the way politicians and the media continue to talk about racist violence, social protest, and continue to see both racism and anti-racism as a public order issue, and as both sides of the same coin. Thanks very much, folks.
Yeah, wicked. Cheers for that, Stephen. That was really interesting and a lot to chew on for people in this session. So has anyone got any answers, Stuart? Not answers, questions rather, questions or answers or comments? If so, like, I think because there's not that many of us, you can either like type it to me in the chat box, or you can just like unmute yourself if you have the power to do that. I don't even know if people do. But yeah, what are people saying? Has anyone got anything to ask about that? I'll give it a couple minutes. Otherwise, I'm just going to think of something and just ask you that. Any thoughts or musings?
Don't know, maybe I just did that Glaswegian thing where I just like speak really, really quickly and nobody heard what I said, which happens a lot.
I'm just going to ask I had a random thought anyway. I thought it was interesting that you talked about how a group of Celtic fans came down and mobilised against the sort of racism that we saw. Because I think that stands in kind of contrast to what we've seen recently in London, particularly with football clubs. So on the one hand, we've got football clubs saying Black Lives Matter and doing all these like outrageous like Instagram posts and Facebook posts about how the players taking a knee. But then on the other hand, we have like the football lads alliance who like kind of obviously see football as a way to like rally like racists and football as a way to mobilize, like as a bit of a throwback to sort of the 80s when like racism in the stands was much more present than it is today. And obviously it's still a thing in football stadiums, but I don't know, I thought that was an interesting counterpoint to see that Celtic are actually like this actual anti-fascism, which is kind of not really that present. I don't think in English football anyway. Definitely not in the South. But yeah, I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, well, in the Scottish context, I think the worker groups like the Green Brigade are a bit of an anomaly. I don't think beyond the Green Brigade there's a deep sort of kind of network of mobilisations amongst football clubs that really kind of exist, and I think that I don't have a great familiarity with English football and the kind of politics of English football fans beyond like the Football Lads Alliance. But yeah, no, I think I'd agree with you. I think that type of mobilisation is probably quite rare, and I think what we've seen in football is, I think a lot of kind of anti-racism has been sort of kind of incorporated into a sort of kind of corporate kind of football way of kind of communicating notions of equality and diversity. And I think that with a lot of football clubs, my feeling is, I mean, I could well be wrong, but my feeling is with a lot of football clubs, it's typical of those sorts of kind of symbolic gestures and performative sort of anti-racism that doesn't have much substance beyond like some of these kind of corporate things and statements and websites and stuff like that. When we look at these clubs, I mean, I would imagine most of these clubs have racial inequality in terms of levels of pay within the clubs, in terms of these statements allow them to do is to say, look how good we are on issues of anti-racism and equality. But there's not much, I suppose, introspection in what goes on in these organisations on a day-to-day.
There's a point in the comments about sectarianism in Glasgow. I don't know if that's intended as a question, but the person's put, I was at the demo in Glasgow and it was a demo against Near's group treatment of refugees in hotel detention. First time I've ever genuinely felt frightened at a protest. And then put risky business here with sectarianism in Glasgow, question mark. So I'm just going to pose that to you as a question. I'm not sure if Rachel W intended it as such, but you know, we've got just stimulating the chat.
Yeah. I think the situation in Glasgow can be frightening. I certainly remember when we did the marches and parades research, and I was along in a kind of official work capacity. There was many times where I was frightened by these sort of kind of confrontations. And I think going back to football, what I was saying about anti-fascism and anti-racism in Scotland, the Green Brigade possibly being the anomaly, what we do see is like loyalist factions of football clubs with an attachment to a particular sense of Britishness, which is fundamentally underpinned by whiteness, taking to the streets and behaving in a kind of violent counter sort of kind of protest way. And I think sectarianism, I'm not always comfortable using the term sectarianism because I think what it can do is it can feed into that narrative of the politics of moral equivalence and this notion of the good guys and the bad guys on both sides. When I think in actual fact, what I would prefer to talk about in the Scottish context and the Glasgow context is anti-Irish racism, because I think that I don't think I mean, we're talking about two different kind of groups that have very different sets of historical and political origins. They're not the same thing. Loyalism and Irish republicanism can be equated as being the same, and therefore expect to be treated equally in some way, you know.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That kind of made me, particularly what you're saying at the end, made me think about. Well, I got another question just because nobody else in the chat is helping me out, so I'm stepping up to carry it. But what you talked about with the sort of that academic Michael Rosey speaking basically similarly about good guys and bad guys on both sides, speaks, I think, to a broader point, doesn't it, about how there is a need to reframe the debate, because there is, like, as part of people's common sense is this idea that, like, yeah, there is good guys and bad guys on both sides, and there needs to be a dialogue. And actually, like, we saw a bit of a backlash. I remember when Richard Spence got punched in the face, and people were like, "Oh God, it's so bad! Like, it's violence against these neo-Nazis." And that is kind of troubling, because we saw this as well with, again, speaking of the football clubs, a lot of them started to distance themselves from Black Lives Matter, despite using Black Lives Matter as a slogan to make themselves look corporate, make themselves look friendly, and like all of this. They really distanced themselves after sort of some of the actual radical demands of Black Lives Matter movement started to come more into the discussion. For instance, defunding the police, and even things like taking down statues. One of my mates is involved in it, and then his dad even said to him, like, "Oh, I really support it all, but you know what they did to the Churchill statue was just a step too far." And I think that kind of speaks to how there is a necessity to reframe the discussion rather than this like balance where we all need to meet in the middle. It's actually obviously like a lot more complicated, but I don't know. It's a kind of a comment, but also maybe a question as to like how that process can begin.
Yeah. So the previous session, I just caught the last sort of the last couple of minutes where I think it was Sita was talking about not trying to compete and create like kind of similar media sort of outlets and stuff like that. And I kind of think in terms of reframing the debate is I think that those who do have a platform can challenge the arguments put forward by for example, Michael Rosey and stuff like that. I think that for me, in the Scottish context, particularly if you look at the issue of kind of republicanism and loyalism, one of the things that councils have tried to do is kind of police by consensus, where it's almost like they're training loyalist stewards to be in control and in order to facilitate these kind of processions so that everything goes kind of quite smoothly and, you know, without incident, where again reduces it to a public order incident. And I think where, in terms of reframing the debate, there needs to be a detailed discussion of what the symbolism of these songs and the things that are on banners and stuff like that actually mean. And it kind of, the work I've been doing with trade unions recently, it makes me think of part of like the argument needs to be about taking people's excuses away from them. You know, so for example, like that police officer of 30 years experience saying, "I've not got a Scooby." Well, do you know what? Like, give him a Scooby. Take his excuse away from him. Get him educated. If he doesn't want to be educated, get him out, sort of thing. And I think that, I think that what we see, and the way in what, just going back to your point, Amit, about the way in which the police football clubs have distanced themselves for the more radical demands of Black Lives Matter. I think it kind of goes back to that point that I was saying, is a lot of football clubs, they do it as a sort of performative and symbolic sort of corporate gesture, and therefore anything that sort of kind of disrupts the kind of orthodox status quo gives them kind of fright and makes them step back. And I think taking that back to what was happening in East London in 1970 with the integrationist approach, a lot of it was about both the ways in which different groups worked with the police and with local politicians to secure consent for the status quo, for policing, for law and order. And I think those conversations in the Scottish context massively need to happen as well.
Yeah, that's a good segue, because Ishan has just come through to help me out with a question. Ishan's, well, lives in Glasgow. He's from Glasgow, I would say. I don't know if Ishan, what do you reckon? Yeah, he's from Glasgow, we'll just say for the sake of this. And he said, the Indie Ref manifestation, what do you think about it, basically? Can it articulate an internationalism via its nationalist rhetoric? And what kind of racial contestations might we expect? And I remember, like, when the referendum was happening, a lot of people in London were like, yeah, like loving off Indie Ref, and were like, I'm going to move to Scotland and all of this. But I think it maybe, yeah, did ignore some of these, like, some of the histories of like colonialism in Scotland and some of these like specific contestations Ishan mentions. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I think those histories of racism and colonialism in Scotland are still very, very much under-acknowledged. There was a book that came out by friends and colleagues of mine a couple of years ago called No Problem Here. And the notion that there's no problem here is that as a kind of play on the Scottish tendency to look at England and say, no, racism's an English problem, it happens south of Carlisle, you know, it happens there, it doesn't happen up here, there's no problem. And I think that Scotland's very, very much in a process of dealing with these issues. In terms of policing, for example, the Sheikh Bayou case is still ongoing. Sheikh Bayou was killed after being arrested by the police and complaining that he couldn't breathe when the police were restraining him. That case is still ongoing, and trying to get justice for Sheikh Bayou. If anyone listening wants to check the work of Samina Akhtar, really good on this. And I think, so this is in response to Isha, and my way of trying to think what my answer is to the potential of Scottish independence. I think in Scottish political discourse there is a little bit more potential for a more progressive conversation than perhaps we see in English politics. However, I think the problems are also very much similar. The vote for independence and the Yes campaign was to win, we would still wake up in a nation where Scottishness to a large extent is still understood as whiteness. We would still wake up in a country with endemic racial inequality. We would still wake up in a neoliberal country where the racial dynamics of neoliberalism continue to reproduce those inequalities. So I think, tentatively, I'd say that there might be a potential for a more progressive conversation, but I still think there would still be a long struggle. To quote that kind of Gramscian language, there would still need to be a kind of long march through institutions to overhaul a couple of hundred years of racism and racial inequality in Scotland.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was a really good answer. Have we got any other final questions? Because we've got like 10 minutes left. But if there's no more final questions, then we'll probably just summarize and take a bit of a longer break. So any other points? Speak now or forever regret not speaking. Or not. Can we have the article, please? Yeah. I think, will you send that to me? Or maybe we can link it in the chat now. If it's.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's on the Race and Class website. I'm not sure if it's free to, it should be free to download, I think.
All right, I've got it. I think.
Careful of it.
Well, I'm going to drop something into the box, but I don't know. It might be wrong. Is that right? Racing class, the colour of the struggle.
See, I've never used. Yeah. It's in that issue. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've actually got the actual one here as well. That's it. Okay, this is so. I'm going to put one of the papers in. I don't know if this is free to view, but if you go on Sci-Hub, you can just like unlock it anyway. Just go on, just Google Sci-Hub, and you can unlock journal articles that want you to pay for them. I've heard, not that I used them in my my PhD. Obviously, I don't. Any pointers to learning more about Scottishness, whiteness? I certainly associate them growing up in London.
Yeah. So I think the book that I mentioned, No Problem Here, which is edited by Neil Davidson, Maureen McBride, Minna Limpat, and Satnam Verde, I think it's a really good starting point. I think there's some really good stuff in there. And I think, yeah, in terms of kind of contemporary debates as well, I would check out some of the, I can forward you on, look up and forward you on some links to podcasts and articles that Samina Akhtar's been writing recently. I think Samina's doing some really, really good kind of original research of the kind of Scottish context in the last couple of years. So I think kind of balancing that book with Samina's ongoing stuff would be a nice connection to be able to make.
Cool, great. Yeah, Sci-Hub, someone's put the link in there, so just you use that. Any other final points, final questions about the East End, about Scotland, or anything else? If not, yeah, I'll give a couple minutes. All right, cool. Yeah, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Stephen, most of all, for delivering the session. It was really good.
No worries. It was my pleasure, and looking forward to contributing in any way I can moving forward.